Okay. Before the rise in popularity of the so-called four horsemen of new atheism, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, Jennifer Michael Hecht published Doubt, a History, Great Doubters and Their Legacy of Innovation, from Socrates and Jesus to Thomas Jefferson and Emily Dickinson, an intellectual history of Western skepticism, 2003 in October. It became a bestseller and helped give rise to the so-called New Atheist movement. And just to give you a little history here, so a lot of us are familiar with the so-called Four Horsemen, and in these books, these famous books, End of Faith, Breaking the Spell, God Delusion, and Richard Dawkins, and God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. But most people don't know that before this, we had the four horsewomen of New Atheism. And I remember when each of these events happened, that it was a big deal. So first we had Sleeping with Extraterrestrials, a book by Wendy Kaminer, Confessions of a Lonely Atheist by Natalie Angier in the New York Times Magazine. Today's speaker came out with Doubt, a History, and then after her, Freethinkers, a History of American Secularism by Susan Jacoby. So they laid the groundwork for then the coming books by the men. Let's see here. So just a second, let me go back. Yeah. Another book she wrote that caught the attention of many atheists was Stay, a History of Suicide and Philosophies Against It. Some of her other books include The End of the Soul, Scientific Modernity, Atheism, and Anthropology in France. The Happiness Myth, Why What We Think is Right is Wrong. Great title, I gotta get that one. And her latest book, The Wonder Paradox, Poetry, Awe, and the Meaningful Life. And I'm a person who likes poetry, but mostly classical poetry, but she's one of the modern poets who write poetry that I actually like. So she's a poet, a historian, a commentator. Her poetry and prose have appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the New Republic, Poetry, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Politico, the American Scholar, and Vox. She's a PhD in the history of science and European cultural history from Columbia. And she's taught history and poetry widely, including graduate programs at the New School and Columbia. She's been a featured guest of many NPR shows, including multiple appearances on The Brian Lehrer Show and On Being, and some television shows such as Hardball, MSNBC, and Huffington Post Live. She lectures widely, including at atheist conventions, which is where I've seen her a couple of times. So we're very lucky to get as a speaker someone who embodies the history of the modern atheist movement. And from her unique perspective, she'll give us her view of atheism today, and she'll also take questions about any of her works. So please welcome Jennifer Michael Hecht.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It was terrific.
We're going to try to get you on. You're not on the screen yet. Chris, can you get her on the screen?
So she does have the spotlight, and if you stop sharing it, she should be.
Oh, I have to stop? Okay. Or can you stop me?
Let's see.
Please, somebody stop me.
Yeah, I think I did. So,
oh, okay.
So now if the Zoom is up there, she should be highlighted.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, we see her now.
Looks good. Okay. Ready? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I loved seeing the women of atheism laid out like that. It was terrific. There's so many things that we could talk about today, but I wanted to try to talk about certain phenomena that I'm seeing in atheism today, where we're living in an interesting time. one key change is that the atheism that we see now is not always entirely on the left. We've seen atheism expanding into the political right. We used to talk about the religious right all the time, and lately you may have noticed that we have stopped saying that to a certain degree. Not that religion has disappeared, but that it's no longer the only or even the primary way that conservative people organize their identity. In some spaces, religion has thinned out, and other forms of authority, loyalty, and meaning have taken its place. And it's a really interesting and in some ways dangerous place that we're at. The history of atheism is profoundly on the left. When I wrote The History of Doubt, there were all sorts of things that I thought I was going to see only one version of, and it turns out the world is much more complicated in so many ways. But atheism on the left has been a pretty stable phenomenon. Why? Because the church on the right has been such a stable phenomenon. The church joined the authority and hierarchy and inequality that secular authorities had. So it was crown and church all the time. And that means that when people were struggling against the church because they didn't believe anymore, they also found themselves struggling in favor of a lot of humanist values. So struggling away from authoritarianism, away from hierarchy, away from inequality, and looking at what we have then. And what we have is the possibilities of freedom and growth and all sorts of public maturities. The commitment to moral progress, social reform, and the expansion of human rights has been almost seen as inseparable from atheism. There have been exceptions. There are some radical priests on the barricades during the French Revolution arguing in favor of freedom and equality. And we have a figure like Nietzsche. There are not many figures like Nietzsche, but there are a few philosophers who have considered what morality looks like without God and come up with the idea that that the morality that we've long had is now nonsense, is now without basis. That's a very rare position to come to. Most atheists have come to the opposite position, that the good morals existed before religion came along and supported them. And even if they don't go that far, they say religion supported the good human morals, and throwing out the imaginary part, the magic parts, doesn't have to affect the ways that we believe in what values are and what we care about. So with that history still mattering, this strange phenomena of right-wing atheism has come along. How did it happen? Well, and I'm going to take questions after all this so we can delve into any part of it. But we can say that just looking at the 20th century, it's profoundly interesting to notice that in the early 20th century, atheism was kind of an open, in public, free topic to talk about. Ingersoll had brought it in the late 19th century into the public domain, and some others have had as well. And it was certainly something that we see someone like Thomas Edison told the New York Times, of course there's no afterlife, of course there's no religious magic. I believe in proof, I believe in facts. To the New York Times without fearing retribution. What happens is that communism was godless. And as soon as after the Second World War, when we had been allies with Russia, but as soon as the Second World War is over, we have our most dangerous, hostile, and world-ending enemy in a country that presented itself as godless. So we presented ourselves as more full of God. It was a way of distinguishing ourselves. And at that time, atheist publishers started to have to go underground or stop. People who were talking about atheism found their work censored, and they found themselves in trouble, canceled in the way that was in the past. The reason we put God on all the money and in the pledge in the 1950s, in response, we can read the congressional hearings, it was in response to godless atheism in the Soviet Union. So what happens in the 21st century is that it begins with 9/11. This shocking new paradigm. We had sort of thought that the end of history because we knew who had all the bombs, and we hadn't realized, oh, planes are bombs if you crash them into things. It was a whole new idea. But what had happened was our most dangerous enemy was no longer godless, but now much more religious than we are. And that right away made it slightly more acceptable and then more and more acceptable to talk about secularism as this great power that we have and that others don't. The freedom that came out of that for atheism really hasn't gone away. It had a boom with the new atheists. And I think the reason, we can talk about lots of reasons why the four horsemen took over, but there was certainly one aspect that they were particularly hostile to religion and responding to 9/11. And that is a big reason why it was such a phenomenon. Responding to 9/11 directly and saying, we have to be angry at this. Religion killed our people. That was a new phenomenon, and it really did change things. And we're still living in that world where it's safer and more public to talk about atheism. So how did this happen that we moved over? Well, into this new kind of atheist movement and new kind of freedoms, we also see a kind of a strand of libertarianism and also just Ayn Rand's idea that that empathy was an old-fashioned idea, and that cultures work best without it. That the people with the most deserve the most, and that they can push for the best of society better than democratic groups can. This never got taken over in a widespread way because we believe in empathy. Most human beings feel it, and that's all you need. Just like somebody can't come up and tell me there's no such thing as love. I can understand they don't feel it, but I don't have to dissect whether it's real. So this new world of atheism that's able to divorce itself from mutual responsibility, social inequality, it marks a real difference from where we used to be. We used to really face this question of what do we do without religion, with a quick running to show, look, we're just as good, we're good. Now to find people on the right whose response to where are we without religion as the dominant force is also a lack of empathy, is also a statement almost to say that those who have it have the most, deserve the most, and that empathy is a problem. That is something that we've heard in public for the first time in a lot of ways in the US. So I think one of the things that we can notice is that irreligion is still on the rise in the United States. It may be in a little tiny bump right now, but for the most part, the nuns, have been going strong, nun, N-O-N-E-S. But as their name suggests, they don't tend as a group to believe in anything. Whereas atheists do tend to have values that they believe in, pro-social values. Not always, but more often than not. Indeed, many of our modern non-theistic ideas of morality, from utilitarianism to vegetarianism to all sorts of Confucianism, an ancient idea of how to order society that is not based on God or religion. We've got tons of them, and they are all in some way responsive to this question of why will people be good without religion? And the answer always has been, well, they will. They will see what is mutually beneficial in our looking after each other. And they will just from their feelings, just from the feeling that it gives them, the good feeling of doing good. What we see in atheist groups now is a profound interest in community and meaning. Community is something that we can do by getting together, by just coming to a group like this, and coming to groups like it, coming to get-togethers. You don't always know what you get from it. You don't always feel immediately that you know why you came. But overall in a life, it can be profoundly meaningful, and especially for atheists who do need to create some idea of community. Though there's also a tremendous community you can have with the history of atheism. I certainly found myself feeling much more like I lived in a world of like-minded people after researching all those centuries of people who were like-minded, men and women, though it's often harder to find the women, but they're there. So I wanted to read a tiny bit from The Wonder Paradox, just a little paragraph. Some who say morality doesn't exist do so because they've been trained by religion to think of morality as stable and singular. After all, the Mosaic religions have moral law literally written in stone. So it might help to clearly state that in moral choices, muddiness of data and competing scales of value are normal. Often we must weigh up allegiances and make good enough choices. Keep family peace or expose a disturbing truth. Finish work or show up for a friend. This messiness can be troubling, but step back and see that it functions. We live, have relationships, raise children, and build careers that serve the public good. Take account of our failures with our triumphs always. And of course, there have been irreligious groups that have done harm. But always remember, too, the poetic, sacred tenderness of how we try and try. Morality is, in some ways, the trying. In this book, I wanted to use terms like the sacred, but I always use it with the word the poetic sacred, to say that what exists within the human world is poetic and beautiful, and it is somewhat different than what the world we can describe through science. Science can tell us about love in all sorts of ways, but learning about facial symmetry or, gene kinship groups, which do explain aspects of romance and love and procreation, they still don't explain away love, the actual thing that we struggle with and deal with and keep and hold throughout our lives. And that's true of a lot of category things that science can only help describe, but within the human world, they are mostly poetic. Love and morality and all sorts of aspects of beauty, that it's helpful to remember that through history, it hasn't only been science, but also the arts that have stuck up for atheism, that have searched. Indeed, why be an artist in a lot of ways? Yes, to if you're worshiping God, you see that in the art, but what about all the other art? That's people trying to figure out what meaning is, how to live, how to be in tune with beauty, outside of a dominant dogma of what it all means. So I think I'll stop there and see what kind of questions we have. There's lots of other stuff we could talk about. Do we know how to do the questions? Can somebody see if there's anything?
Me?
I'm happy to talk about any of my books as well as anything I've said now.
I'm going to try to turn the laptop so the camera faces the audience. Anybody?
Hi, everybody.
Okay. Hello. Okay, we got a question coming here. Switch on the minus and the red green light comes on. Green, there we go.
Hi there. I'm intrigued by your proposal of the right atheists. And, you know, I do see maybe the focus isn't only on religion, where it used to be very much right religious, but I don't know that I see that equating with atheism so much as, I mean, I still can't imagine any of them thinking that godless was anything but awful and attacking people who would not stand for the pledge. You know, so I think a focus away from religious right to only right doesn't mean that the religious foundation isn't still embedded there.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I certainly appreciate it. And there's unless people confess and are proud of such a position, we can't always know. On the other hand, the lack of reference to God and religious verse in the way that the right talks about its plans and negotiations. To me, there's a big shift there. I certainly appreciate that there's that a lot of people still go to church, but a lot of them don't. And a lot of people are still basically referencing back to God and religion. But modernity has made room for other ways of approaching things, it seems to me.
The only two right-wing atheists I know of are Robert Price and S.E. Cupp. Are there any other famous ones out there on the right-wing side of atheism, politics?
Right. It really is, as I said, more of an overall feel that we're no longer stemming everything from the Bible and the church. So that certainly we see on the left a freeing up, so that there's less paying homage to God and religion as an automatic knee-jerk thing that you have to do in order to get elected. And so when we're seeing it on the right, we're seeing a common phenomena that the public discourse is becoming less religious. So yes, the idea of people on the right proclaiming their atheism is not a common thing, but the phenomena that we're in, where we want to get out ahead of it a little bit and notice that that traditional atheist groups who see themselves as humanists and see themselves on the side of equality need to start thinking about how we're going to argue against this other idea of a secular culture that isn't humanist, or isn't expressly humanist, which in the past it's always been. I can Yeah.
Since we share a love of poetry, who would you consider to be the most humanistic poets?
Oh,
Some examples.
sure. The history of poetry is in large part humanist poets. So it's easier almost to list some of the figures in the, say, the Norton Anthology of Poetry. You've got somebody like Hopkins, who talks about batter my heart, three-personed God, and talks about religion. But almost all the other poets are struggling with the reasons why. You see someone like Keats talk about looking at his own hand and knowing that it may not be alive for very long. He knows he's sick. He's already got tuberculosis. And when he gets in that dark mode, he says he goes down to the ocean to think till thoughts of love and fame to nothingness do sink. He goes to a natural phenomenon. He lets himself be overwhelmed by beauty. He doesn't go to the church. He doesn't talk about God. He doesn't talk about that struggle, but his dear compatriot Shelley wrote Queen Mab, wrote this wasn't poetry, but on the necessity of atheism, got himself kicked out of Oxford for writing the pamphlet on the necessity of atheism. And throughout Shelley's poetry, we see someone who's making sense out of life and death without reference to God or an afterlife, and trying to find beauty and meaning in life because it has an ending. I'll give you one more. Emily Dickinson is someone who is so cryptic in some ways that people have argued that she is religious. People have argued that she is a doubter, and people have argued that she's a resigned atheist. She certainly said atheist or non-religious things. She certainly said atheist things, that the other people in the house believe in a sky god. She said everyone else goes to church, but she stopped when they said she was of age. She had to proclaim her belief. And she said, well, I can't. So she stayed home. That was that. The first place she stopped going was church. Then she stopped going a lot of other places. So those are some of the classic poets. But poetry today is profoundly engaged in finding meaning and beauty and trying to find some kind of idea of truth through the poetic experience of searching just beyond what we can search in science and staying with the real in a way that religion doesn't. So really creating a whole new category.
You have a question in the chat. Can you see it, or should I read it?
I didn't see. There's a question in the chat. Let's see.
I suppose we should read it so our audience here can hear it. You can, could the speaker characterize or provide some insight into the interactions or relationship between the Christian nationalists and the atheist right? How are these two groups interacting so far? So Christian nationalists and atheist right.
Yeah, I think, when we call them by slightly different names, it sort of jumps out, which is the whole right has been sort of perverted by Trumpianism, and it's hard to fully understand. I certainly do not myself fully understand how many on the religious right have been able to follow Trump. We all know the explanations that we get, that they're willing to take any kind of leader to get the things that they want. But that's very problematic. And I wouldn't have guessed that they would have gone this far. That was historically surprising to me. So the answer right now is that they're both interacting in a kind of response to Trump and trying to get as much as they can of what they want in a kind of schizoid theoretical moment, because it's very hard to just plain believe in Trump, who doesn't really believe in a lot of things. He doesn't give off believing in things. So the people who are following him can come up with their own kind of belief systems and match them to whatever he's willing to give them. You know, the work that I've tried to do with atheism, you know, I wrote Doubt not really knowing that there was an atheist movement. I wrote it as a historian. I was getting my PhD in history, and I found a bunch of atheist French anthropologists working at the turn of the 19th century, and I found them fascinating. I was already an atheist, and so I found that they were public atheists as well as anthropologists, really engaging. But when I was writing that book, I found that, or first the dissertation, which became a book, you know, I found that there was not a good history of atheism anywhere. Either they were religious and argued really that no atheists really had existed before, or in some cases they were atheist and they were arguing too much in our favor, overriding some facts. I wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know just how much certain of our founders believed. I wanted to know what we should make of Plato and his spheres of reality that are not quite reality. I wanted to go through and figure this out. And so when I wrote Doubt, I was writing it very much, well, what I found when I was done was that it fit with what a lot of atheists groups could use, a kind of guide to all of this story that had come before us. It certainly made me a happier atheist to have written it. And I think the books that I wrote after have all been, in some ways, provocative, even to our own group. So I wrote the book Stay, A History of Suicide and the Arguments Against It, knowing that our side, the atheist side, has traditionally argued for freedom of suicide. And I wasn't at all contradicting end-of-life care, which I separate entirely. As a matter of fact, though I don't say this in the book, if there are a couple of people who agree with you that your life is torturous and untenable, well, you're in a whole different category. I'm really talking about the solitary figure who hasn't really thought through, perhaps none of us do until you really have to, how much it would hurt other people, how much you might regret trying if you tried and survived. The argument was provocative, and yet over a lot of time, I've found a lot of response from non-believers who had not had a kind of secular scientific way of talking about this. And with the wonder paradox, there's a little bit of provocation in there too, just in that when I started to give talks about doubt, right away, people could hear from my talks that I'm not against ritual. I don't believe in anything, but I see so many non-believers loosely take part in some religious ritual and feel conflicted about it. And it seemed to me that if you bring some poetry to it, some secular poetry to it, some of these can be translated back into the secular. You know, we all know that Christmas started in all sorts of pagan rites. Well, yeah, and it can continue in some ways in that way. And that's true of other holidays as well. And sometimes the holidays are worth keeping. Certainly what I was writing when I wrote The Wonder Paradox was partially in response to how we've started to use non-religious poetry at weddings and at funerals instead of prayer. And sometimes there's prayer also, but there's very often poetry so that there's something meaningful there for the non-religious people who are otherwise left with nothing at this most intense moment of change. Both weddings and funerals can be intense for people. And we traditionally give them something to hold on to. And we've come into the modern world doing that with poetry. And that was really the impetus for writing this book, to ask, in what other ways can we look at what non-religious people don't get, and how we can fill that in with a poetic, with either poetry itself or a poetic look at how we live and how we interact with each other. So I know that I'm in some ways being provocative in all of these ways, but it was out of a total love for the atheist community and wanting to see if we can move it forward and what directions we can move it in, and trying to start some conversations, which I'm happy to say have all bloomed. So even if I got some negative response to say stay, after a time, some people, even some individuals who told me that they didn't believe what I was saying and that we had a right to kill ourselves, came back to me and later told me that some aspect of what I'd written helped them through a dark night of the soul. And yeah, you don't have to get many of them to feel like, okay, this is worth trying at least. So there, I gave you some more stuff to respond to in case there's any questions on a more broad look at my atheist career.
When you were just talking about ritual and all that, I couldn't help to think about Tom Flynn, who was against all ritual.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, he had this wonderful book, The Trouble with Christmas. And on Christmas Day, he was always at the Center for Inquiry taking questions from around the country. So it was kind of a ritual, even if he didn't want to admit it or not. And,
yeah, when ritual has been defined in so many different ways. Anthropologically, it's almost anything that you do on a regular basis. We can, it's hard to say there's no ritual in anyone's life. We all morning rituals, that is in the morning, waking up, brushing our teeth. The need for ritual is very individual. I have a very low need for ritual. I like having some in my life, but I certainly don't go around practicing complex religious observances. I take part in the most secular way that one can imagine, but keeping some degree of family gathering and community gathering. But I certainly think that, well, even in a group like Freedom from Religion, it's not always with the greatest hostility to some of the things that religion has given us. Like days off where we think about certain things and come together. So certainly there have been atheists who I admire and like very much, who have had a strong anti-religious ritual position, and I just disagree. Mostly in a sort of practical way. I'm more asking, what do people really do, and trying to understand it. So it's the fact that people really do these things. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so interested. If everyone went to the courthouse to get married, it would be a different thing, but that's not what we see. As a matter of fact, in France, that has a very strong atheist history, there really was, out of a sort of democracy and secularism, a movement towards getting married in the mayor's office, and it really is a strong secular statement still. We don't see that as much here in America. So I'm really responding to what I see people doing, and what I hear after my doubt talks. I would often hear from people who were terribly conflicted because it was hard to negotiate how you are supposed to live with then beliefs that say that all of that is bad. Where again, morality pre-exists religion. There's lots of ways of showing that. And all sorts of community behaviors pre-exist Christianity, certainly. And so even some of the specifics of Christianity, like liturgy, was a word that meant that the richest people in a certain area had a responsibility to hold certain festivals. that was the liturgy, that was the list of things that had to get done. That got folded into Christianity later is another one of these gestures where we can look at and sort of backward solve and find ourselves in history.
So I was looking at your bio, like I believe a month ago, and I was looking at your book titles like Stay and Doubt. And like it did make me think about one thing, is that like is there any like inherent life to like human life in general, or even like a person's experience like you know, after they pass away, whether like it's something like internal or even like external, like because a lot of people associate atheism with nihilism. Like I see atheism as like yep, it's a leaning more towards like the valuing truth over things we want to believe, and I view nihilism as like a sort of creative seed. But I feel like people automatically have negative associations with this. So my question is basically, is there any like inherent value or meaning behind life? Like should people like be like okay, that person had a good life, or should we just like not care about like whether a person has a good, beautiful life or things like that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting. I personally believe that when atheism was in a kind of hot battle against religion in a public way, the atheist side in some ways gave up too much, as if, okay, now morality is religion's business, and okay, mattering is something that religion can claim, but we can't. In the argument against suicide, one sees on the religious side a kind of statement that people matter. It's not their biggest argument. Their biggest argument is God will be mad at you, don't do it. And in many ways that has even faded to some degree. And so that is no longer the guardrail it was for religious people. But to me, the idea that human beings matter intrinsically, that they matter, is a poetic but true statement. How do you make claims in poetry? You have to say what you feel to some degree, as well as what you think. And you have to be willing to have people argue with you or not agree, because it isn't science, it isn't proof. Science takes in everything it can measure and prove, and it leaves out what it can't. If we want to talk about the idea of each human being mattering, we have to do that from our guts, from poetry, from history. And I believe that we can. And I believe that it's almost obvious that we would if we hadn't been in this fight against a church, which had a monopoly on mattering and meaning in that way. And I think as time goes on, we'll be responding less to that struggle in that innate way. Yeah, I hope that that answers it. That mattering and meaning have always been part of the atheist world, but we haven't always been sort of proud of our ability to come to that opinion on our own without God. You know, when you start to say without God, what did God really bring to morality? Didn't give explanations for why tsetse flies kill infants painfully. That was one of Thomas Paine was particularly incensed about that, as was Mark Twain. What do we do about believing in a moral God who tortures infants to death? Morality under God was just this idea that, hey, he'll figure it out. He'll sort it out. It makes sense. It matters. It's just we don't have access to how it makes sense and matters. But what is that really? How does that help us in any way? It doesn't really, you know, an afterlife I can argue for, I see a purpose in, but the idea of God sort of ordaining morality, ordaining mattering. What do we need him for? It's just a third party figure in the middle. But if he doesn't tell us what matters and why it matters, if we don't get the big secret, then we're really in a position where we're just offloading mystery. And as atheists, we can offload mystery into poetry. We can say, yes, I'm not always speaking scientifically. Sometimes I'm speaking about the entire human experience that isn't always scientific, but is very fuzzy and changeable. Okay, I guess unless there's anything else, I very much enjoyed talking to you all. Any final thoughts?
The other side of the room.
Yeah, regarding what you just mentioned, when I had the sudden house of cards fall from belief in church of all places, because I was supposed to examine my conscience, it actually was comforting to figure out, if you took that out of the picture, the world made so much more sense. And I think it was that morality bit, like, you know, of course I had a male sense guy, didn't help really figuring anything out. If anything, just threw things in there. And so I kind of resonate with what you're saying, that it's really not a useful figure.
Yeah.
All the interpretations of, you know, this religion versus that sect versus, you know, I mean, obviously these things don't make sense a lot of the time. And to realize that you can get beyond this God and just look at each other and figure stuff out, that seems to be kind of self-evident. I mean, there's always going to be places where, like, family values, well, that's even a loaded word. I mean, what part of the family do you value at any specific time? The older sibling, or the older child, your parents, your children, your spouse? I mean, there's, you know, even that is problematic, you know. So anyway, I thought that's a kind of a good
Thank you. Yeah. And I think we have to just remember that if we define morality as written in stone, as a definite hard fact thing, then yeah, it's hard to find in human culture. But if we define it somewhat more like we define love, that we know what it is, we aim for it, we circle around it, we are driven like a leaf around the idea of the good, but we do know what it is. Yeah.
Earlier you talked about taking religious rituals and secularizing them.
Mm.
And one group that's done this a lot are secular Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They take Passover and then secularized it to
Yes.
age things. There was an attempt to do this in the atheist movement with the Sunday assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't followed that too much. Do you know, is it still alive? Do you know?
It's still alive, though. I think it has faded a little bit. It was very lively in England for a while, huge meetings. Yeah, I think they're wonderful for all the people who miss that aspect of church, the getting together, the singing, the sitting and listening to a moral homily. And then there are tons of us who wanted to get out of being in religious buildings before we even had the philosophical reach of it. So it's for some people, and a lot of people still prefer more what you guys are doing, sitting together, thinking together, and chatting, and having a more social experience rather than that kind of communal singing, being in an audience.
Getting back to originally we're talking about, you did already allude to this, but how the religious right and the atheist right seem to be meeting in libertarianism.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little more.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of change in libertarianism as well. I think it was more popular about 5-10 years ago, and I'm hearing a little bit less about it. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that's something that happens. And for a while there, we saw people who we would recognize as being on the right or as on the left, identifying in this sort of middle ground libertarianism. But I think what happened was that there were a lot of different causes that people were seeing as enveloped in that. And some of them upset people, and so people left. Certainly, a lot of people see Islamophobia as entirely right-wing, because they want to, because they see humanism as for all humans, and want to see, well, it's enough to say there are people who see Islamophobia as a large marker of moving to the right, and there are some who don't. Some who prefer not to even use that term, and who just say all religions are problematic, and that one is as problematic, and I'll attack it as much as I want. And that was one of the things I think that libertarianism got a little shaken with.
Your book, Stay, talks about reasons to stick around. And previous question referred to nihilism. And then I'll go to the opposite end to have you comment. The movement of better to have never been born.
Well, better to have never been born. My God, what a philosophical statement. Look, as a poet, I can say that I think that I love life, but that it's awfully complicated. It's an awfully brutal place. And people who want to express that in a variety of different ways are all people I have some sympathy with. I certainly don't find life profoundly easy. I see it as complex and complicated and struggle oriented. But we do on our own each have some impression of whether life's beauty it outweighs its cruelty, and we march ahead with whatever we can come up with. But as Schopenhauer would point out, sometimes we cling to life without even a good argument for why we should. So yeah, your question is too big. I can only say some of it, which is that for me, life is worth living precisely because other people find it worth living, and our interaction is what makes life the most worth living. I think truth is almost always shared, something that people come to together.
This is more of a comment, personal thought than a question, going back to the ritual. I'm a believer in ritual, but I kind of feel like religion stole our ritual, like they commandeered it for their purposes, and that I sort of like claiming it back, so all of the stuff around the solstice, whether it's Christmas or Hanukkah, but I love the darkness and the sky and celebrating that in spite of religious ritual. And I was at Hanukkah time with a Jewish friend of mine, and it was not only about celebrating the darkness or the light, but also the call to be the light in the darkness. There are ways of sort of reclaiming it for your own.
Absolutely.
And I have nothing to do with
very
Easter,
poetic
but
idea.
I'm always looking forward to the emergence of the butterflies and the bumblebees. So, like many of these were initiated just by nature and its glorious, and religion stole it from us and overlaid crap on it. And I just want to claim it back.
Yeah, I love that. And if I thought they would all actually be successful, I would think that it would be terrific for us to come up with all our own holidays. But we've seen a lot historically of people trying to, and they're not always successful. For the most part, they don't last. The solstice thing has lasted. I love it. I celebrate it as well. It is hard for individuals to make up, or groups to make up, new names and new holidays. They just don't always take. And so very often what does take is a kind of mutated version of what had been there. And so that's partly why I celebrate that as part of what non-believers can do to make sense of their lives. The year is cyclical, and we can celebrate the seasons if we have them where we live. But having these moments where everybody comes together and does something also has this value. But yeah, I actually, if we could do all secular holidays, all fresh and new, with deep meaning and poetics, and I would go with that. But I'm more describing what I see in the world. And what I see is people sort of going along with what their family and their jobs and their general town is doing, rather than being hostile to it, to sort of, to reclaim it.
I guess I don't know if mine is more of a question or another like comment of like looking at monotheistic religions and like how they furthered the disconnect of the people from the land.
Mm-hmm.
Changed it from being joyful about like, yes, the spring has sprung, like, look what the earth has given to us, instead being like, look at what this non-tangible thing has given to us instead of the land in front of us, and makes me think of like how important it is to remember that like every religion did come from something. It came from somewhere, and it has ties to other things, like speaking on like the pagan religions of like Samhain and everything, Imbolc and everything,
Yes.
are overshadowed and overpowered by those more like Christian like cultured.
That one was even moved from the end of from spring all the way to the fall to match with All Souls Day.
It's like how the Yuletide like season, it used to be you decorate a tree outdoors, you don't bring it in, and like the just bastardization of those like nature forward thinking process.
Yep, exactly so. And it's most profound when there's something real that it is associated with, like the whole world waking up again. Yeah.
Your book Doubt, I read that shortly after it came out, and I really liked it, because I never really considered kind of back talk about the last comment, that for any change to happen, there had to be questions about the current thing, or some influence
That's right,
from this dominant way of thinking to something different. And I don't know why that never occurred to me, but
I actually hear from religious people who hadn't really ever asked themselves, well, where does a religion come from? And if they're at least somewhat secular, historical minded, you have to ask. They don't appear out of nowhere. We see Zoroastrianism, and then we see Christianity, and that becomes Catholicism, and then there's a break against Catholicism to Protestantism. These moments are always looked at as moments of great heresy, people rejecting what they've been taught to believe. And sometimes some of them come up with some new things to believe totally, but some of them always escape through the corners and find the secular philosophers who are on all the shelves. Even long after the church had gotten really strong, after the Roman Roman Empire had sort of receded away from Europe, the church was strong. Where was I going? I just lost my train of thought. where were we? That the church is itself is based on questioning, and that each stage of it has to be based on a moment of questioning, a moment of heresy, and a moment where some people escape. And right, I was going to say that when the church was strong, but a lot of literacy had fallen away with the Roman Empire, the church still taught Latin so that you could use it for Christianity by using the old ancient Roman texts, which were secular. So they were still in even the church libraries, and you could find them, and people did. People did.
You said, I think you were a happier atheist after researching this. And I mean, I was always a calm atheist in a way after I figured it out, you know, yeah. It was sort of a house of cards falling for me, but I had to kind of keep it to myself for a long time. And then, you know, gradually found people. I was in the closet for a long time to most people. And I would, after reading your book, it was just like another thing that I felt like, yeah, I belong as part of humanity as much as these other people, you know, and you.
That's right. That's right. Both in terms of that we're the inheritors of the entire philosophical tradition and secular art tradition, but also that our take on the Judeo-Christian religions is still valid, even though our answer to it is no, none of the mystical stuff. But we're still the next generation. History will look back and say, what did they think? And what we think is just as valid.
Even my own history, as far as being raised Catholic, I had this, you know, fall of faith when I was a senior in high school, I think, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I still went to a Catholic school to get my pre-pharmacy credits in, and that was close by. But even that was such a switch. The philosophy of the nuns was so much more liberal than this town I grew up in. And science was taught like science. They didn't, you know, they didn't quibble evolution in science. I mean, you know, they had a good and everything. And it's almost like they've got, the Catholic schools have regressed.
Yes.
You know, I think even in Minnesota. And like, I wasn't going to send my kids to a school that had a saint in front of it. Like you know, because I was, you know, this conservatism and shutdown of thought was really happening, I thought.
That's right. No, I think that's really true. I think, I mean, I even remember a couple of decades ago reading in the New York Times that the Pope had changed his mind about evolution, and it was now problematic. But for a while, the papacy was perfectly fine with evolution. So God made evolution, they said, big deal. So that there's absolutely been a kind of closing of ranks and a rise of conservative values in the Catholic Church. There are always exceptions, but yes, that's a phenomenon which I've seen. Yeah, and before that, Jesuits were terrific secular teachers in many ways. They just had a tradition of literacy.
Wondering what you think about a liberalizing movement in Islam. I've heard that there are a lot of, of course they can't come out, but atheists in places like Iran and Bangladesh. And someone was even telling me today that there's a gay pride celebration in California that had a Muslim contingent celebrating gay pride. And here in Minnesota, we have Representative Ilhan Omar, who's very strong on gay rights.
That's great.
Are you seeing any liberalizing, secularizing in?
Well, I get mail. I get emails from ex-Muslims who tell me that for the most part they are very much in hiding. Not that they're out and in hiding, that they don't tell anyone so that they can live. But I get letters from people from our from Christian traditions in the United States, of people who also feel that they'd lose their job and lose their families and lose their friends. But I certainly am also tracking, keeping an eye on the atheist movements in India, which are huge. So one hopes that there are different cultural paths to secularism and rationalism. One hopes.
Just an observation on that line. So Minnesota Atheists, we've hosted a Day of Reason at the state capitol since 2007 in the rotunda, which is very ornate. And people were terrified of us originally because we'd have our atheist sign up there.
Yeah.
A secular Jew got comfortable in the second year. She started, she gave a talk, and slowly it progressed. Well, in this last year, it was a new phenomenon. We had 7 lawmakers. We would let anybody come up and speak, whether they liked us or not. If you're willing to stand under an atheist sign, you can say whatever you want. And we had a lawmaker say, I don't like anything you stand for, but you have the right to be here.
Right.
So this year, 7 Democratic lawmakers came while the House was in session. We have a bicameral. They sent a logistics person to coordinate them leaving the floor and come and speak so that the floor would go on, have a lack of representation. And they brought a professional photographer to take photographs that they put on their social media. So in just a short period of years, we went from the piranhas to here's somebody who has, and the central theme was, we have religious legislators who came and spoke, was empathy and caring about the fellow human being.
Right.
Nobody had any qualms about speaking in front of the atheist group.
That's terrific.
That was a kind of a unique observation.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thanks for that. It's just good to know. You know, there are crowds where I want to ease my way in, and I hit secularism first, because a lot of people believe in the separation of church and state, and a lot of people are worried about this country because there's so much problems around separation of church and state. Tremendous amount of religion in the schools in lots of places in this country. It's I hope that people are less frightened of just the word atheist. It certainly seems so. The Pew studies seem to show that the assumption that a non-believer couldn't be elected is no longer what it was, which was really solid for a long time. But there's more room now. Okay, I think we've done it.
Yeah, I think we're done. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.